Behind me is Edinburgh, and this is what's called the Ha. I can't actually believe it's taken 14 films for you to see it. It is a sea mist that rolls in and grips Holyrood Park, which is why I've started my morning jaunt today on Winnie Hill, not Arthur's Seat or indeed Crow Hill, where I usually walk with you guys. It's amazing how remarkably disorientating it can become very quickly. The little clip of film that you saw at the beginning there was actually just 9 minutes. You can see that the hill became completely engulfed. Anyway, Jake Jackson and I did a video that's got a few views this weekend as part of this month's Spitfire Journal, linked below, and it was a ramshackle shootout of reverbs that we've used over the years, and we didn't use reverbs we hadn't used because they weren't field tested for us. Sorry I couldn't include a Bricasti, but the bank balance isn't as healthy as I'd like. But it raised some really interesting questions. The first was, why would you use more reverb on orchestral recordings when they're already quite ambient? And I guess the first pragmatic answer is that regardless of the budget, I always like to work with at least one live musician, more if I can, but it's very unlikely on a lot of low budget stuff that I do that I'll be recording them in the same room. Indeed, I think that probably applies to pretty much any score. You know, you'll always find overdubs or underdubs, might be recorded even in your writing room, something that a director becomes attached to. So it's vital that they don't sound like not part of the band. So in order to marry, I find that it's not just about adding reverb to your dry sounds, it's about adding reverb to everything to marry it together. I think it creates an audio kind of illusion that your ears can't really disentangle. The other reason we use reverbs is when you record music and put it under dialogue and, say the atmosphere of a cityscape, cars, that kind of stuff, all of that pink and white noise really dries up your mixes. It creates a very kind of arid feel, and it also makes it feel less stereo. It makes it feel more mono. You get less sense of the room. So we have to overcompensate by really sploshing it up. And what I try to do if I'm doing an album version is go back to the studio and pull back some of the splosh. But I guess this brings up more of a broad question about how you actually prepare music for the dub. So I'm going to take you back to the man cave to look at the Pro Tools session that I created for the dub for the last episode of Inside Number 9 and the Logic mix session from which it was derived, and we will discuss the hotly contested issue of stems, which is an old-fashioned word that stands for stereo masters. Now, the reason we use stems is so that your music has a fighting chance against dialogue, sound effects, etc., etc. I think I witnessed the kind of birth of the real heavy use of stems over the last 20 years. And at first, composers really fought against it because they didn't want people messing around with their mixes. But I think you soon realise that if you don't stem up stuff really kind of radically, then they just bury your music against dialogue and effects because they just have no control over it, or they're on the phone to you all the time asking you to remix this, that and the other. So basically stems are portions of mixes, so it's not like individual instruments necessarily. And I think the way that you need to think about how you stem stuff out is what things are going to possibly clash with dialogue. So separate those out so you're confident that at any given point they're fully isolated and can be ducked against the dialogue or boosted if need be. So this last episode of Inside Number 9 was quite queer because I did it as one cue. It was quite an extraordinary piece. I can't give too much away, but basically it is a single scene. So it had its kind of internal rhythm. And in fact, I did very few tempo changes. The only one I did, I believe, was for a moment, the only moment where a character was sitting down and talking. The rest of the time, they're all standing up. So I did it as a single cue. So let's just go kind of in reverse order. Let's start with the Pro Tools session and see how I delivered it. And apologies because I'm going to have to switch this mic off because I use tools to record my VOs. So we'll be switching to camera mic. Here's what I delivered for this last episode of Inside Number 9. Now, what we always have is our checkerboard. So that's an A full mix and a B. This is because often cues overlap. So you basically need two sets of your stems. Now, someone asked on YouTube, is there a kind of limit to the number of stems? You wouldn't believe how deep they can go. I think, 18, 20 stems for big Hollywood movies is very, very common. I guess it is simply based on how big your arrangements are. And I would say it's the key is having isolation for any element that could affect dialogue. You kind of want to make sure, it's almost like thinking of your music as voices, and you want to stem according to the different voices. This was a really contrapuntal piece, so I've stemmed out as brass, woodwinds, piano and harp, miscellaneous. There did used to be limitations on how many stems you could provide, and that was often, I'd say 50% how many we could provide, so how many reverb units. When we go back to the Logic session, the mix session, you'll see that there is actually a dedicated reverb kind of send for each stem. So this was very much a limitation in the past of how many stems we could provide. It used to make the process incredibly slow, especially when working with 5.1. The other thing that was a bit of a nightmare was that if you gave them too many stems, they ran out of mixing desk space. Now you get these enormous mixing decks which have many layers, so it's not just that many tracks once, it can be half a dozen of those, so literally hundreds of tracks that they can work with. So even if you're delivering, say, 10 5.1 stems, so that's 60 tracks times 2 for your checkerboard, that's 120 tracks, they'll still be able to handle it. So I create a full mix, which I always mix actually within Pro Tools from the stems. When you're doing 5.1s, you also need to do something called a fold down, which basically takes it from 5.1 to stereo. That's when they're doing different versions, and that is when hell can be unleashed. I've done a major feature film which got released on DVD in mono, and I think it's because of the way the fold downs were created. It wasn't just the music, it was everything. So it was a real shame because we worked really hard on getting an amazing sounding soundtrack. So basically that's all done. Single timeline for the whole episode, and then what I would usually do is select all unused, delete unused, and then save copy in without the movie and all of that kind of stuff, and that's what I'd send them. And most dubbing theatres now use Pro Tools, which is great. So they just literally import session data from your session and off they go. You're safe in the knowledge that your score is intact and in sync. So that's the Pro Tools session. Now let's move to the Logic session, which is what I mixed in. Usually, even if I'm mixing myself, I would track lay and mix in Pro Tools. But this, again, it had a flow, it had a dynamic and a balance against dialogue that was effective. So I felt, no, it's great. I'll just mix it in Logic. And ostensibly, there's very little in the way of plugins and stuff, but it was a sensational bar count. I got up to 1,300 bars. I am going at a rate. It is on average about 170 BPM, but that's still a good 31-minute cue. And basically, the idea was, other than just giving myself a challenge, making myself just work in a different way. So I'm not kind of relying on muscle memory, I'm challenging myself. Because it was a single scene, I just want it to feel like a single piece of music that was having a brief tacit sections, was having natural breaths, so everything could flow. And by the end, it was amazing, because once I was receiving notes, I could just go right down to there, copy that and pull it up right up here and drag stuff around and move it without kind of having to open different sessions, etc., etc. So I really enjoyed working this way. Okay, so the way I stemmed it out is I did pianos and harps, and I yellowed them all up, and then woodwinds, brass and strings, a percussion, and a miscellaneous. And the miscellaneous was this little cheeky chappy, which I knew could become bloody annoying and really interfere with dialogues. So that's an example of when I stick a single instrument on a single stem. So I have actually discussed this in another vlog, but I just wanted to go slightly more in depth. And basically what I did was I set up 2 buses for each stem, the live bus and the reverb bus. So each stem goes to its individual bus, and then its corresponding reverb channel. And then I've got the same Lexicon Reverb, mix 100%, chamber, quite a short delay. Now, the reason we have to have a dedicated reverb is you can't have a reverb for the entire mix on just one stem, because if they want to knock out the brass, then the brass reverb will remain. Also, if they want to, say, turn up the brass, suddenly they'll get drier. So you basically need to have a dedicated reverb or set of reverbs for each stem. So as you can see here, it's coming in on bus 7, which is what we agreed here. So that's the harp reverb that then goes into the dry and live. I set up some auxiliary channels. And the reason I do auxiliary channels is I don't particularly like having to, every time I open up a cue, I don't particularly like having to activate channels. And then these are the tracks, the stem tracks that have the same inputs. And so as and when I'd mixed it or balanced it, I just put those into record and off you go. Now, with Pro Tools, if you were to use this system, and this is the system I would use when I'm usually mixing in Pro Tools, not Logic, then there is a way of bouncing that via the buses. But to my knowledge, I can't find one. So I simply had to sit down and put it in real time into record. And it was good because it meant that I could listen back to any mistakes and stuff. There were a few false starts. Okay, so that's basically that. A few things that I think you have to be careful about with using just one session for a single cue for a whole episode or film is if you're not working to a locked picture and they give you some picture changes, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare because you've got a single timeline. So what I would do at that point is just start splitting it all off into separate cues from this kind of master pass. The other thing I was really cautious of is every kind of few hours I saved a copy of the cue. I think we've all had a situation where for some unknown reason a cue has become corrupted, and obviously in this situation that would be the entire episode, which would be a disaster. And that's about it really. I mean, I guess if I were to kind of hand over any of my experience about dubs, is they can be a bit of a bun fight. I think certainly on the things that I do, the sound department and the music department, never the twain shall meet. They really, we're of completely different worlds, completely different cultures. So it's very rare for me to actually work tightly with the sound department, especially on TV series like this when we're all working at a rate. So everything comes together in the dub, and it's my job as a head of department to try to make it so it doesn't collide. The simple fact of the matter is, if you haven't paid attention to dialogue, they're just going to bury your music. They can't. They don't have time to sit there writing your music or writing the effects against your music. So I think a couple of tips are always write your music with dialogue as master, the loudest thing in the room. So you're writing around it. You have to imagine that your mixes are going to be heard probably 12 dB quieter than you would like. So if you want it to be dynamic, you have to be aware that those dynamics get ironed out. So if, say, for example, you're going, I'm going to take it from 20 instruments to 30. No, take it from one instrument to 30, and then your listener will really get that sense of emotional shift in dynamic. The other thing to do, but again, I would check this with the dubbing engineer, is sometimes you may want to actually conform your Pro Tools file so it's really sculpted around the dialogue. But some dubbing engineers don't like that. Some dubbing engineers like to look at waveforms and to know, right, that's going to get a bit louder. Not that waveform gets louder and then you've got a load of automation automating it out. This vlog is going to be ongoing, so I'm sure I'll share lots of other experiences from dubs. But as I say, they can be a difficult beast. I'm not entirely sure sound departments understand why they need music for films and TV. Indeed, I've even heard of a very famous director saying, you've got to watch out for those fuckers, talking about us composers, because they change shit up. So I think there is a degree of resentment of the necessity for music. So by giving stems, it allows them the ability to really work with your score, feel ownership in it, but also not call you up.